Hi, this is Shambhavi. Welcome to my weekly podcast about spirituality, love, death, devotion, and waking up while living in a messy world. The Satsang with Shambhavi podcast is recorded live each week with students of our nonprofit community, Jaya Kula. For more information and to find out about attending a satsang, visit jayakula.org. Thanks for listening. Much love to you, wherever and however you are.
Is free will in the stream of wisdom, or are they just two different things?
Well, we wouldn't ever use that word, free will. First of all, that is such a loaded phrase in U.S. culture. No one would ever understand if we tried to use a phrase like free will to apply to our sadhana and to self-realization. It would be universally misinterpreted here. And it would be misinterpreted in favor of maintaining that individualistic sense of self that can go along and make its own decisions irrespective of actual circumstances and trying to get what it wants in a very narrow sense. So there's a Sanskrit phrase, Icha Shakti, that is often translated as will, but that's actually quite an erroneous translation, at least in light of Trikashaivism, where it's always translated as desire. The kind of desire that Icha Shakti is, it's objectless desire. It has no object to gain. It is the impulse that fuels this wild self-expressiveness that we call manifest life. So the point of life, when we're talking about this tradition or, any tradition of self-realization, is not to get things. And it isn't to accomplish anything, because everything has already been accomplished. There's already full compassion, full wisdom, full intelligence, full clarity. As Ma said, Purna Brahma Narayani, everything is full of creative wisdom, Vidya Shakti. Already, there's nothing to accomplish. So that's why we can't use the phrase free will. And swatantriya, which is the word in Trika, which means freedom, doesn't mean free will. It means freedom of self-expression. The idea is that this alive, aware reality is overflowing with all of its self-expressions, or the reflections of its own nature, which we call worlds and beings. And that what is propelling this is this joyful impulse to create, we call Icha Shakti. So there really isn't any room for a more Western philosophical notion of free will. It's even a question of whether there's room for a Western philosophical notion of freedom. That's actually something that I've wondered about. What is the nature of freedom in Trikashaivism? Because really, the freedom to self-express is coming out of the necessity to self-express, because that is the nature of this reality. So there's not a choice to not express one's own nature. We don't have that choice. And in fact, even this idea that Lord Shiva could totally withdraw the manifestation and cause some cessation of the creation is also not present in Trikashaivism. The idea is that creation, maintenance, and destruction are happening at the same time everywhere. And we may notice little local patterns, like obviously there's a lot of destruction happening right now. There may be local emphases on one or the other, but there's no time during which the fundamental nature of reality isn't being expressed. So then what does freedom consist of? It's hard to say. Ma said, you people talk about freedom. I don't know what you're talking about. She said, I don't even have enough room to turn around. Meaning that she was experiencing herself as the fullness of all of reality. But within that, whether or not we have to completely jettison any Western normative idea of freedom or not, the fact of the matter is that we experience this freedom as we do sadhana and divest ourselves of various tensions, karmic patterns, we experience a kind of freedom. The freedom to respond to things in a more uncontrived, natural way. It does actually feel like freedom. It's freedom from the constrained, contrived, stale, small, compulsive ways that we normally respond to things. We are freed from responding that way. So, for instance, if you're a person who always fights back when you're criticized, and usually if a person is like that, they always fight back when they're criticized. They're usually looking out to make sure no one's criticizing them. There's a kind of vigilance that goes along with that kind of attitude. That's enormously imprisoning to always be in that state. So when you can divest yourself of that, it feels like freedom. You get to make different kinds of choices in situations about how to respond. You can be more adaptable. You can express more of yourself without worrying about what anybody thinks of you. And you don't have to adhere to convention so much if you don't want to. I mean, not that there's necessarily anything wrong with adhering to convention, but you don't necessarily have to. There's lots of ways in which we are constrained to respond in certain ways to certain situations. And when we experience lack of constraint, then that feels like a kind of freedom. A freedom of what? To just have a much, much wider range of possibilities for self-expression. And also your mind can go in many, many more places. I always joke around because students sometimes come to me, they're worried because they have some kind of question about spiritual life that they think is like a dangerous question of some sort. And I say, no one has gone as far into the danger zone as me. I would ask my teachers any question. There was just nothing that would stop my mind from going there. So this is a kind of freedom too that we gain. And of course, the description of the nature of the Lord is infinite potential for self-expression. So the closer we can come to that, the more, Swami Lakshmanji says, the more we are like Lord Shiva. In the Western mindset, if we don't have freedom, then everything must be determined. We don't have to stay in that little box. That's like a culturally, historically conditioned choice that we don't really have to stay with. Nothing is conditioned at all in the view of Trika. The zone that we're in when we're talking about Trika or Dzogchen, or maybe other direct realization traditions, we're not in the zone. Karma, cause and effect, has no meaning in the absolute. The karma is a relative experience. It's not a fundamental aspect of reality. It's part of the self-expression. It's an aspect of impermanence. Everything on an absolute level is completely improvisational. It's like the grandest improvisational theater, infinite cosmic improvisational theater. There is absolutely no cause and effect at all, or determinism. Again, we may experience that in our little local worlds, but that's because we are participating in dramas that are local. But those things are an aspect of impermanence, and in this tradition, those are the glamour. They're the magic of this world, that we can have all these different stories happening at the same time. But we have to remember that they're stories. There's nothing absolute about that. Ma called this Kayal, of course. That gets expressed in part through the idea of grace, that the Lord, or this reality, this live aware reality, in its freedom, its swatantriya, can, as both Abhinavagupta and Ma said, make the impossible possible and the possible impossible, meaning that really, even though it looks like, from our perspective, most of the time things are just plodding along in the same old way, from the perspective of this reality, anything could happen at any time. All laws of physics could be completely contravened in a moment. A completely ignorant a-hole could become enlightened for no reason, having done no sadhana. Anything could actually happen. So that expression, which is grace, meaning the intervention of grace, is one of the ways that freedom gets expressed, or the lack of any actual rules gets expressed in this tradition. And of course, people in the West, in their drive to not actually have to do any hard work and wanting instant results, have latched onto this idea of instant enlightenment or Shaktipat or grace as somehow I'm just going to go pay someone to give me Shaktipat and then I'll be enlightened, or it'll be some tremendous blessing. Well, the thing is, if you don't do anything with the blessing, it's nothing. It's like buying some incredible food and sticking it in your refrigerator and letting it rot and never eating it. That's one thing that's very tricky, learning when the very questions we're asking are in a particular domain, culture, history, discourse, community, and that those questions are not applicable outside of that. That's tricky to be able to discern and to kind of get outside of that to see what is really being taught. Very tricky.
Actually, wanted to ask about what should be the ideal lifestyle of a sadhak who's wanting the truth, the daily schedule, and
This kind of tradition doesn't have one kind of schedule that's going to be the same for every person. One of the reasons is that each of us has our unique dimension. We all have equality on the level of the nature of ourselves, but then we all also have personality and karma and all that. So we have this aspect that is totally equal among all beings, and then we have this other aspect that's totally unique to us. Our sadhana speaks to the uniqueness of each person. Now, when we're born, we already have a full complement of karma, and each of us comes in to this incarnation with histories upon histories. Some of us have aspects of ourselves that have done a lot of sadhana in a previous life, and we come in with a lot of sensitivity, and other people come in a different condition, or maybe we have sensitivity, but we also have some other thing that's an obstacle. We're all completely unique. And then there's also how this tradition pays a lot of attention to Ayurveda. So we all have a constitution. So for instance, you say, when should we wake up? Well, the sort of standard Sanatana Dharma answer about that is you should get up in the hours before sunrise. So 4 to 6 a.m., depending on the season. And you should do your sadhana, like start before the sun comes up and do it while the sun is coming up. But if you're sick or if you're depleted, you shouldn't maybe do that. Maybe you're going to need extra sleep. Or if you live in a part of the world where the sunrise and sunsets are all at wacky times, you're going to have to adjust for that. Or if you have a certain kind of a constitution, you may need less sleep or more sleep just to be able to function. And as householders, these are all householder traditions. We're paying attention to those things. We're not imposing some sannyasin type of a lifestyle on people. I think it's a good idea if you're in good health and you feel rested when you wake up. I think it's a very good idea to get up an hour before the sun comes up, or at least half an hour, and practice as the sun is coming up, of course, because the sun is a living symbol of prakasha, the light of consciousness. So as it's coming up, being in that circumstance, that is also helping us to realize our true nature more. So there's an actual functional reason why it's helpful to our sadhana to get up at that time. But then you have to pay attention to other things too. You can't just be rigid about that in every day of your life, every circumstance. Sometimes we have to pay attention to other things too. But I will say there are some general pieces of advice that I think do apply to everyone. And these are advice that I've gotten from my teachers over the years, but also things that Anandamayama taught my Sadguru. One is to do sadhana every day at the same time. Our patterns, our habit patterns, our karmas, we practice them every day, 24 hours a day. And we have many rituals that we do related to our karmas that we practice every day. So in order to change the momentum of that, we need to counter it. We need to counter those karmas with an opposite force that redirects that energy into the process of waking up. And to do that, it is most effective if we practice every day at the same time. So the advice that I give my students is, unless you are really sick, practice every day at the same time. And then some people just absolutely can't do that because they have very young children or they have some kind of a job that has very irregular hours. And so again, we're being compassionate. It's better to practice than not to practice. It's better to practice every day at the same time, but it's also better to practice than not to practice. So if you have to practice every day, sometimes at different times, that's second best, but you do your best with the circumstance that you're in. Ultimately, if you want to make waking up at the center of your life, if that's your central desire, is to discover the nature of reality, the nature of the self, eventually you have to organize everything around that. So if your job is not conducive to doing sadhana in the best possible way, and the sole central goal of your life is to wake up, then you are going to get a different job. You're going to get a job that lets you do your sadhana when you want for as long as you want. You're going to set that as a goal in your life, and that's what you're going to do. The other thing that's very, very important is to take care of our bodies so that as much as possible, our bodies don't interfere with our sadhana. And this is also a teaching of Anandamayi. So learning about your constitution, learning what foods are proper for your constitution, learning how to take care of yourself, knowing when you need to go see a doctor or when it's something you can take care of, eating healthy foods, eating organic food if possible, all those kinds of things to take care of ourselves, getting enough movement. All those things will help us to be able to do sadhana, and they are very much an integral part of our practice. The other thing that all the people that are working with me closely, I require them to take a vow that they won't do any recreational drugs and that they won't drink to inebriation. That is something I feel very strongly about. Maybe other teachers don't, but I've always felt strongly about that. And Anandamayi said that waking up is waking up, and you can't wake up if you're stoned. That isn't exactly what she said, but that was the gist of it. That's a real requirement for me, that people not be using recreational drugs, particularly marijuana, which I think is really a difficult substance to deal with when you're trying to do spiritual practice. And then there's some other things that are requirements for everybody that, as you said, if you want the best result, right? And number one is honesty, the absolute bottom line, honesty. You want to be honest because functionally, according to Ayurveda, honesty preserves and increases ojas, which helps you in so many ways. I can't really go into all that now, but I don't know if you've heard this word ojas, but basically ojas gives you much more stamina in your practice. And it also is part of being able to eventually experience universal love and compassion. So it's very important to preserve ojas. And honesty, being honest, is a medicine that preserves ojas. It also decomplicates your life when you're honest. We can't realize what you call the truth. I wouldn't call it that, but we can't realize the truth if we're in a state of fantasy. There is no truth in fantasy. The only reality of fantasy is the fantasy. So we have to be absolutely honest about ourselves, where we are with our practice, not building fantasies about our practice, and being extremely sober and down to earth and grounded about our practice, and simple, just being simple about it. People make so many complications about it. And also here in the United States, there's just so much rampant pride, and everyone is trying to be something and be important and be admired and be great. You know, all that stuff is utterly, utterly useless and absolutely in our way when we're trying to wake up for real. So there's many different layers of honesty that are really, I think, the key to everything. And when we are honest, that's a kind of sincerity. It's a commitment. But I will tell you that sincerity, and particularly honesty, is rewarded by wisdom, by giving us more spiritual opportunity. Satsang with Shambhavi is produced by Jaya Kula, a nonprofit community offering opportunities to learn and practice in the direct realization traditions of Trika Shaivism and Dzogchen. If you enjoyed listening, please help us keep this podcast and many other teachings open to all by making a monthly or one-time donation. Visit jayakula.org to make a donation and explore more of our offerings.